The time is at hand.
From the land of the rising crackheads in Williamson, West Virginia, you are in Dark Places. I'm your Huckleberry, Junebug Fugit. People seem to have really short attention spans for some reason. I don't know why. It's kind of dumb. But a couple months ago, all the rave was those drones. Everybody was seeing drones. They started like in New Jersey and they just went everywhere, all around the world, back in November. And then they just kind of stopped talking about the drones. So what happened? Well, here is the White House press secretary with a little update on the drone situation.
I do have news directly from the President of the United States that was just shared with me in the Oval Office from President Trump directly, an update on the New Jersey drones. After research and study, the drones that were flying over New Jersey in large numbers were authorized to be flown by the FAA for research and various other reasons. Many of these drones were also hobbyists, recreational, and private individuals that enjoy flying drones. In time, it got worse due to curiosity. This was not the enemy.
I don't know. I'm not buying it. What do you guys think? Something fishy about those drones. We're finally starting to get some warmer weather here. It's been a while. It's giving me kind of a little itching feeling to get out in the hills. Me and Brandon love to go hiking, and it's getting about that time. We're going to have to take us a little hiking trip. I've probably told this story 2 or 3 times before on the show, I think. But the last time I went out in the hills by myself, I got this weird feeling like I was being watched. Felt kind of creepy. I was going to have a little target practice up there, and something in the back of my head just kept telling me, no, don't do that. That's not a good idea. Just leave. Maybe it was something. Maybe I've just watched too many Bigfoot shows. I don't know. So, nice segue into this week's topic. Afraid in the woods. There's all kinds of scary stuff out in the woods. You got the usual culprits, mountain lions, bears, snakes. Then there's also the more unconventional type. You got some Sasquatches out there, Dogman, Mothman, gnomes, you name it. All kinds of stuff out there to be afraid of. Anyway, on to the stories. My family is from the mountains. One night, all my grandpa's hound dogs started going nuts, barking like crazy. Grandpa, my dad, my uncles, and all of us younger boys armed up and went outside, thinking it was a bear or perhaps a pack of feral dogs. Grandpa opened the kennel and let the reds and blues run. They went barking into the woods, got quiet, and ran back to the kennel. Grandpa latched the gate, and him and my dad and my uncles started walking back to the farmhouse. Me and my cousins were looking around, and I asked Grandpa, well, ain't we going to find out what it is? And Grandpa said, very shortly, whatever will run them hounds out of the woods can stay there. Said it without even looking back. Me and my cousins stayed awake all night, terrifying ourselves with every sound we heard. Rule number 1 of the woods, don't go in the woods without a gun. Rule number 2, if you ain't got a gun, stay out of the woods. I am a Marylander and spend a lot of time in my local forest and wilderness areas all across the globe. I have definitely witnessed things in the woods that I cannot explain. Last summer I heard a woman boo-hooing by the lake as if her heart had just been broken. She was down in a really technical, steep, rocky area, and it was raining steadily. I was about to call down and ask if she needed assistance, but then my gut checked me. Something was off. I cannot explain it, but my hackles went up. I felt like it was a trap. My instinct put me in silent mode, and I got out of there. It took me a few weeks to go back to that area of the forest again. I have seen and experienced even stranger things back there. I know lots of people who will not go hiking in our forest, even though it and the beautiful lake are literally in our backyard. But I have been hiking and exploring alone since I was a small child, and I guess I'm used to it. You'll never ever catch me out there after sunset. I usually spend hours exploring out there, but I absolutely get out. by the time the sun hits the horizon. About 10 years ago, I was exiting the woods in Middlesboro, Massachusetts, near the Taunton River, just as night was falling. I was bow hunting and about a half a mile from my truck. Suddenly, about 50 yards away, I estimated a huge roar/scream erupted from the woods to my rear left, where I knew a deer trail ran parallel to the main human one that I was taking back to my truck. Anyway, it was an enraged sound, vastly louder than what a man might replicate. Then I heard it approaching me, but a row of short pines stood between us, and I couldn't see what the creature was. I knocked an arrow and began walking again. When I stepped, it stepped, and when I stopped, it would stop an instant later. It paced me like that all the way back to my truck as darkness set in. When I finally made it to my truck and turned on the headlights, the thing screamed in absolute rage again. I never saw what it was. I assumed it was a Sasquatch that wanted to kill and eat me, but I never saw or heard it again. I have hunted in the same spot since then, but now I always leave the woods before nightfall. Yeah, I think that's a Bigfoot. My dad was from the Appalachia country in Virginia. He would go to work and most always get home before dark. One night he was much older than 18, and he was coming down a mountain called Hanging Rock. He said he was starting down the mountain when his car stalled and went over the side of the road and back down, and the back door creaked open. Something got in. The car started, and my dad went down the mountain. He said he didn't look back at it. He had a strong feeling that he shouldn't. He said whatever it was so heavy it weighed down the car, and it creaked and popped. But as soon as he was over the mountain, his car died again, went over, and the door opened, and he could hear something big running back into the woods. My dad didn't talk about it much, but he would never let himself be out after dark if he had to go up or down that mountain. I am a hunter. 2 years ago, I was headed to my stand at 4 a.m., armed with a flashlight and a crossbow. It's a half-mile walk to the stand. Well, I start hearing what sounds like Native Americans talking and chanting in the distance. There are none in my area. Then I hear sticks breaking. I hear my name 2 times, very faint. I spin around. My light hits a very large black thing. At first I thought it was a bear, and then I noticed it was way too long and slender to be a bear. It almost resembled a werewolf from Harry Potter. I set my light down to keep it on it. It froze. I put a crossbow bolt through it. It dropped. Wanting to confirm I killed it, I walked up about 20 yards from it. It got up. It gave me that a-hole look, and I began backpedaling out of the woods. It would not come out of the woods. The next day I go out to look for blood, and I noticed there are rocks with weird symbols on the edge of the woods. I'm assuming it's a very old containment. I mean, I don't want to say spell, but that seemed like that's what it was. Never go into the woods at night unless you are fully armed. I'm staying in Scotland with my girlfriend, and we booked a cabin getaway with a couple friends in the lower Highlands. There's a sauna just outside the cabin that I'd be heating up during the afternoon, and just as it's getting dark, we all went for a walk along the stream close by, accompanied by our dog and 2 friends. When we returned to the cabin, it was dark, and we decided it was sauna time. My girlfriend and one of our friends went out to the sauna and got as far as the side of the gate, and then came running back in. They said they had seen a huge, white, deer-like creature that was almost human-like. There were sheep in the local area and a few deer, but the deer were sandy brown, and the sheep were way too small. I know a little about geology, but I am aware that the Highlands of Scotland and the mountains of Appalachia are one and the same, land that long ago separated. My brother likes to ride a dirt bike trail in the woods of Alabama, and he came back one night scared and with a skint leg, but he would not talk about it. That was very unlike him. A few years go by, and he finally tells me the story. He was riding the trail, and he came upon a split. Something came out of the right side, and he hit his brakes, sliding the bike to the left. He said it was feline in nature, but the size of a black bear, with a flat face. It made some kind of weird sound, like a woman coughing, and charged him, so he gassed it and never looked back. To this day, he refuses to ride at night in the woods again. My deer camp is probably the only true tent camp that I know of. Comprised of a Korea War Army tent for sleeping and a Boy Scout wall tent for cooking and eating. One night we are all asleep, and around 3 or 4 in the morning I was startled awake by the loudest, scariest scream I have ever heard. It sounded like it was literally right next to the tent. At the time I thought it sounded like a big cat, but in this part of northwest Michigan there aren't even bobcats or mountain lions. It literally scared the pee out of me. I held the rest until about 4:30 a.m. and when we got up for breakfast. I know that was likely an owl, but I had never heard one make that sound before, and it was terrifying. Here's a weird one. I was hunting a few years ago. It was the first week of gun season in Missouri, right before dusk. The woods got really quiet, and the ground looked like it was vibrating or something. I don't know how to explain it. It looked like it was shimmering or shaking or something. I thought my eyes were just playing tricks on me, until I walked back to my truck and my brother, who was about a half a mile away, asked me if I had seen the ground moving. I don't know what it was. It wasn't really scary, just really weird. It didn't help that my wife made me watch Missing 411 before that season. I think it's a portal. I think this is how the Sasquatches kind of travel and pop in and out. They come through portals. I grew up hunting, fishing, and just spending time outside, messing around, doing whatever. One time I was squirrel hunting by myself when I heard something flying over me. What I saw wasn't making any sound, but I could hear the trees moving. I looked up and I had no idea what it was that I was looking at. It looked like a huge rock or mass of earth or something, 40 to 50 miles across, just above the tree line. I remember this like it was yesterday. It disappeared out of sight, and I never heard or saw anything after that. I dream about it every now and then. I tried researching it, and I have no idea what I saw that day. I never told anyone about it because I even second-guessed myself, even though I know I saw something. I saw a UFO in the woods, just above the trees. Huge triangle, maybe 50 yards wide. 4 orange lights that reminded me of how hot metal glows. Absolutely no noise. Scared the living crap out of me. I turned and ran to grab my handgun out of my truck. Why, I have no idea. By the time I got it and turned around, it was gone. No noise at all. I had spent hundreds of nights in the woods hunting, and up until that point, I had never seen anything like that. About 4 years ago, I was elk hunting in Idaho with my son and his wife. We went up on a ridge, and while I by myself went up a ridge across to the west of them. We were probably a mile or more apart in heavy timber. I got to the top, where I could see a ways, where it had been logged a few years ago. I'm sitting in a good spot where I can see down both sides and along the ridge. I'd been there for maybe a half an hour when I would hear 3 loud knocks that echoed down the mountain to the southeast. I didn't really think much of it. Then after about 10 minutes, there's 3 more knocks, this time closer. Now I'm wondering what it could be. About 5 more minutes and 3 more knocks. And this time they are close, just out of my sight. I'm like, what in the world? My hairs and my arms are standing up on end, when all of a sudden I hear voices. I can't make out what they're saying, but it's more than one person talking. They are getting a bit closer, and I still can't see anything. They are maybe 100 yards or so down the hill. I can now hear a little better, but it sounds like a foreign language or something. It sounded like coughs, snorts, and grunts. mixed with some sort of language. Now I'm on my feet looking to see what's down there. It's starting to get dusk, and the light is dimming slowly. I see some movement to the south on the ridge, and there I was watching a large, dark hair-covered figure crossing the ridge. It was huge on two legs and moving at a good pace. Its head set low on its neck, with the chin down near its chest. There was no hair around the eyes or nose. The nose was like ours. It didn't stick out far, but it was big. The arms were long, like to the knees long. The shoulders were wide, I'd guess between 3.5 to 4 feet across. The hair was probably 6 to 8 inches long and dark. I guess this thing would be between 8 to 10 feet tall. I put my scope on it before it disappeared. I could see the muscles on its legs and back moving. I just couldn't shoot. It looked too much like a human. I never saw the other one, but I believe it was watching me. I heard movement a few times as I made my way back to the rig, and then I had to wait in the dark for what seemed like forever before my boy got to the rig. They heard the knocks, but couldn't tell what it was. We went back the next morning and couldn't find anything other than a sign of something heavy going through. This wasn't my first rodeo where Sasquatch is concerned. I saw one back in the early 80s from several hundred yards away. My wife and I had one run across the road in front of us in a snowstorm back in the mid-80s. It was white with a pinkish and red face, but this time I heard them talking. I wish I would have gotten this on camera. I've never heard anything like it before. I wish this one had more details. But this guy says, I have seen a deer walk on 2 legs and heard a small child's voice deep in the woods. That's bad medicine. I don't hunt in those places anymore. And I can't really find any kind of other further details. I want to hear about the not deer. This one says, I have seen floating yellow lights. They stayed to the sides of me, and I would see them out of the corners of my eyes. When I would turn to face them, they would move quickly to my peripheral vision, like they didn't want me to get a good look. They were like very, very bright fireflies, but stayed lit and moved very fast. In English folklore, this phenomenon is referred to as the will-o'-the-wisp. This is the closest explanation I can come up with. They were there, and as real as anything I'd ever seen. It scared me because I was hunting alone, and a long distance to my truck. I don't know if my brain was misfiring or what. It felt and looked real, though. I'm certain something was following me through the woods. The woods are only creepy if you make them creepy. I lived in a large military base in Alaska next to a large patch of woods with a lot of local legends and rumors, but me and my friends didn't care. So one night, my parents are doing game night, and I walked outside after playing COD, and we decided to play a game we made up called flashlight tag. Basically, you can only chase someone if you train a flashlight on them. At around 11 p.m., me and a friend just sat in a bush, and as I'm sitting there, she walks off to find a better hiding spot. I'm just staring at the woods when, after 20 minutes, out of the blue, a gray face appears about 10 feet off the ground and just stares at me, grinning with like a maniac, head tilted, and it starts moving closer to the edge of the woods. So I just book it across the field to the houses, scurry up a tree, and just sit there questioning what in the world I just saw. I looked up what I saw recently, and the closest thing I found was a Canadian Alaskan Wendigo-like thing called a windwalker. The story happened 6 years ago when I was 15 in my village. I don't tell this story much because people tend to think that I'm making it up, but I've been thinking of it quite a lot this week, and I want people to know. My village is located in a rural area that is protected by the government because it has been considered a natural paradise for the last 30 years. This means that exploration in this area is quite difficult nowadays, since it is forbidden to cut trees, which means that it has a huge forest. I was spending my summer there, and my favorite thing to do was to go hiking, although I had never gone alone into the woods, just roads with people. My grandma had told me that cleaning services had opened and rehabilitated a path that had been covered in bushes and trees for the last 30 years because of a race that was being prepared, like runners and stuff. Usually, I'd go into the nearest town, about an hour away by foot, by the only way I knew, on the road. On my way back from seeing friends there, I took a new path that my grandma said was safe, alone. The first part of the path was the easiest, just too many obstacles and landslides, but it was nothing compared to the rest. The second part of the hill was full of rocks. That was the hardest thing to go up. Literally had to climb on 4 legs like a dog. When I got to the top, I looked around and I found some animal bones. Didn't pay much attention to it since the area is known for its big population of wolves and bears that go out at night. I continued my way faster than before. This part was plain floor, where the woods really begin, so it was a relief until I got to a dead end. Some huge trees had fallen exactly on a row on the path, and it was impossible to cross them. This seems really off to me because there were no other fallen trees. The weirdest part, aside from these trees, was a little barn. Yes, a barn in the middle of the woods. I thought to myself that it was probably abandoned. It looked like it, so I decided to throw my bag into the little field that belonged to the barn. Then I crossed the fence. I crossed it without realizing the most bizarre thing. That field had no trees in it. It was clear. No bushes, no big plants, nothing. It really shouldn't be like that if it was abandoned. I started feeling concerned about how the location of fallen trees was so coincidental. How there casually was a barn beside with a clear field where the path had been closed for 30 years. Just seemed really off. I went on, and luckily I was reaching the last hill my grandma had described, the one that connected with the village. Suddenly there was a silent moment in the woods, which allowed me to hear some branches crackling behind me. I thought to myself that it was a bird or something, but they came closer. They really sounded like footsteps. After trying to convince myself it was probably an animal, I was afraid, so I couldn't look back. I started walking faster, and guess what? So did the footsteps. I just started running after noticing that, and so did the footsteps again. I was running for my life at this point. Suddenly, I started hearing incredibly loud grunts. Everything was going really fast. Luckily, I got to my village in a minute or so after that. I got into the patio of the first house. I found a closed door. It was a relative's house. No need to call the police. I stayed there for 10 minutes until I got my breath back, and then came back home. I get chills from remembering the place, not having a signal in the middle of nowhere, and the grunts. It makes me think there was something following me, since the barn and the trees were just a distraction to slow me down. I never went into the woods alone again after that. And that sounds like a Bigfoot to me. I've always been drawn to the cold, to kind of an isolation only the dead of winter can offer. There's something about the snow-blanketed silence that settles over the world that feels sacred. So when I got the chance to stay in a remote cabin in northern Minnesota for a week, I jumped at it. The cabin belonged to a friend of my uncle's, a retired logger named Red. He was the kind of man who wore flannel like a second skin, and could whittle a masterpiece out of a branch without breaking a sweat. Red gave me the key, warned me to keep the fire stoked, and offhandedly mentioned, "Watch yourself out there. These woods have a way of changing a man." I laughed it off. Everyone likes to make the wilderness sound more mysterious than it is. The first 3 days were perfect. I'd wake up to the glow of the sun filtering through frost-coated windows, spend the day hiking in the trails, and return to the warmth of the cabin by evening. The woods were alive with the sounds of nature. Snow crunching beneath my boots, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional rustle of something moving just out of sight. It wasn't until the 4th night that I noticed the silence. It crept in gradually. No birdsong in the morning. No distant howls at night. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. I chalked it up to the weather, but by the 5th day, unease had settled into my chest like a stone. The trails I'd grown familiar with seemed different. Trees gnarled and twisted in ways I didn't remember. Paths that seemed to double back on themselves, leading me in circles. The air carried a strange scent, metallic and sharp, like rusted iron. It clung to me, making my nose sting and my stomach churn. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone wouldn't let me shake it. That evening I decided to stay close to the cabin. The sun set. The world outside the frosted windows seemed darker than it should have. The firelight flickered weakly, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Around midnight I heard the first sound, a distant, bone-deep crack, like a tree snapping in half. The noise made me jump, and I sat bolt upright, straining to listen. The wind had picked up, howling around the cabin. There was something else, buried beneath it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn I ventured outside, hoping the light of day would chase away the unease that had gripped me. Instead, I found tracks in the snow. They weren't human, but they weren't quite animal either. Long, narrow impressions with clawed toes that dug deep into the frozen ground. The tracks circled the cabin. I told myself that it was just a bear, a big one, maybe starving from hibernation. But the claw marks etched into the cabin's wood door suggested something else entirely. They were too precise, too deliberate, as if what had made them wasn't scratching. It was testing, searching. I spent the rest of the day barricading the doors and windows, piling furniture against the walls, and keeping the fire roaring. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that nothing would happen, but by the time night fell, I was shaking. And then the screams started. They didn't sound human. High-pitched and wailing, the kind of sound that makes your teeth ache and your skin crawl. They came from deep in the woods, at first faint and distant, but growing louder, closer. I could feel it more than hear it, a thumbing vibration in the walls, in my chest. The fire crackled weakly, its light dimming as the shadows pressed in closer. Then came the scratching. It started at the front door, slow, deliberate, a soft scrape of claws against wood. My breath caught, and I pressed my back against the far wall, clutching the fireplace poker-like it was some kind of talisman. The scratching moved, circling the cabin, growing closer as it dragged across the walls and windows. I saw it then, or at least I thought I did. A flash of movement in the dark, a tall, gaunt silhouette with limbs too long and joints that bent the wrong way. Its eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the dying firelight, and its teeth. God, his teeth were the color of old bone, jagged and yellowed. I froze. It stopped. Then it spoke. Hungry, it rasped, the word dragging out into almost a whimpering growl. I don't remember deciding to run, but I remember the panic, the surge of adrenaline that pushed me to fling the door open and sprint into the woods. The cold hit me like a wall, but I barely noticed. Behind me, the door slammed shut, the creature's guttural screech splitting the night. I ran blindly, snow crunching beneath my boots, branches clawing at my face and arms. The woods seemed endless, the trees twisting and warping as though alive, their shadows writhing like serpents in the moonlight. The thing followed me, its movements erratic and jerky, the sound of its pursuit, a cacophony of snapping branches and guttural snarls. I could feel its presence behind me, a suffocating weight that pressed against my back, driving me forward. I don't know how long I ran before I tripped, my foot catching on a root hidden beneath the snow. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. I looked up. It was there. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its emaciated frame towering over me. Its eyes burned with a dull, sickly light, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. It reached for me, its claws outstretched, and I swear I felt the cold radiating from its body, an unnatural, deep-bone chill that snapped the strength from my limbs. In that moment I thought I was going to die. Desperation does strange things to a person. My hand closed around a jagged rock, and I hurled it with all the strength I could muster. The rock struck the creature's head with a sickening crack, and it recoiled, letting out a blood-curdling screech that made my vision blur. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my legs burning, my lungs seizing with every ragged breath. Somehow I found my way back to the cabin, creature didn't follow me, or if it did, it stayed just out of sight, its presence lingering like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I barricaded myself inside and waited, clutching the fireplace poker like a lifeline. The dawn came slowly, the first rays of light cutting through the gloom and chasing away the lingering shadows. I stepped outside, half expecting to see it waiting for me, but the woods were silent again. Too silent. I left the cabin that morning, hiking back to the nearest road and flagging down a passing car. I didn't look back. For weeks after, I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that the isolation, the cold, hadn't made me imagine it all. But the scratches on the door, the tracks in the snow, and the lingering metallic scent on my clothes told a different story. I don't go into the woods anymore, not alone. But every now and then, when the nights grow long and the wind howls through the trees, I think about that thing, about the way it looked at me. Not just with hunger, but with recognition. I started dreaming about it too. The clearing, the screeches, the feeling of cold claws brushing against my skin. And every time I wake up, I feel the same pull I did back then. A whisper in the back of my mind telling me to go back, because something about it feels unfinished. And the hunger, it wasn't just its hunger. It's mine now too. I don't know, I think it's a dog man. But why did you leave the cabin? You should have just stayed there to start with. Well, that's about all the stories. We're woefully out of time. There's going to be a bunch of parts of this one. It seems like it could be a recurring topic for another day. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week. God bless.